My name is Jim Simons, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Convocation, sponsored by Monte Vista Grove Homes in Pasadena, California. And of course, this is our first convocation of the new year. We are continuing our theme, cultivating inclusive community. And on this day, January 6th, we are reminded of a country that is in desperate need of inclusive community. And so we think it's appropriate for our speaker today, who will respond to the challenges that America faces on this particular day. I'd like to say something about convocations. That's a new development for us. Monte Vista Grove Homes is a retirement community, and we have formed a partnership with a neighboring church, San Marino Community Church, and that partnership is being expressed specifically in the tech person who is working for us today, Jonas Strefford. And Jonas is a delightful guy who is going to be helping us all through this winter and spring season. And this has come about because of the generosity of the San Marino Church and the minister, Jessica von Lauer, who has been so helpful in bringing this about. So we're just delighted to have a new chapter, a new beginning for our community here. Today, Ron White is our host, and he will introduce our speaker. Ron.
Thank you, Jim. In the spring, when our Convocations Committee met, we looked at the calendar and discovered, oh my goodness, the first convocation is January 6th. We always meet on a Thursday. Who would we invite to speak? In 2002, I traveled to Washington, D.C., and to start talking about a new book on Lincoln. I told Craig Barnes, then pastor of the church, now president of Princeton Seminary, that I would like to worship at the congregation that Sunday morning. He said, may I send a copy of your book to Pete Wehner? He's a member of our church. He's part of the wrestlers class. What an amazing name for an adult education class, the wrestlers class. And he's a speech writer for President Bush. Lo and behold, to my surprise, Pete invited me to have lunch with him at the White House, and that began a friendship. I've watched over the years as this person of deep Christian faith and remarkable understanding of politics has secured a wider and wider audience. Some of you know Peter Wehner because he writes regularly for the New York Times and also for the Atlantic magazine. He spoke to us in April of 2021, and Pete, we're delighted to welcome you back again. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Well, thank you, Ron. Good afternoon to all of you. It's evening here on the East Coast. It's great to be part of this convocation, the new year, and I wanted to thank Ron, who really has become a friend, a source of wisdom. He didn't complete the story, but we went from lunch in the White House to be eventually inviting him to a meeting with the president, which began a friendship between them, which I know that is important to President Bush as well as to Ron. And I've learned from him as a historian, but mostly as a person of faith. So it's great to be with him, and wanted to thank Jim and Jonas for inviting me and for helping to pull this off technologically. And to thank all of you really for your own lives and the witnesses that you've been, I think agents of grace and the love of Christ in a broken world. So thank you all for what you've done over the course of your life. I'll make a few sort of opening remarks that Ron had asked me to, kind of reflections on January 6th and the divisions that we see within the country, and then we'll just open it up to Q&A, which I really look forward to, and I think will probably be of the most interest to you. But but this is an important day, a solemn day, and it's taking place within a certain context. So let me offer some thoughts on those things, and then we'll take it from there. You know, the events a year ago, I mean, each of you had your own thoughts, I'm sure, as you were watching the events unfold. For me, I found myself virtually in tears as I was watching what happened a year ago. I'm not someone who's normally brought close to tears, at least in the realm of politics, but in this case it was, because I think what I was witnessing, what I felt like I was witnessing, was a desecration of something important to our country, and not just to our country, but to the people of the world. And I think the sheer ugliness and the violence of that day, and the pulsating hatred of that day, were an astonishing thing to see. I should also say, and I say this as somebody who has been up until 2016 a lifelong Republican. I've worked in 3 Republican administrations, the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administration, before I did work in the George W. Bush White House for seven years. And I've been a lifelong conservative. I still consider myself philosophically a conservative. But I broke from the Republican Party as Trump was taking control of it. And so I don't consider myself a part of the Republican Party anymore. To coin a phrase, I felt like they've left me rather than I left them. But in any event, whether that's true or not, I do think that what we saw that day, and what we've seen since that day, is that it is a thoroughly Trumpified party. That for some people they'll think that's a good thing, for some people they'll think that's a bad thing. But I don't think it's really disputable that it's a Trumpified party right now. And what we've seen since then, as I think most of you know, probably all of you know, that the majority, in fact, the vast majority of Republicans believe that the 2020 election was stolen, and that Donald Trump has referred to it as the crime of the century, which is quite a claim, especially since that claim is not based in empirical reality. It's manufactured. It's make believe. The election was actually secure and safe and honest, one of the most in our history. But we live in a time, I think, of unreason, a time of unusual conspiracy theories that are out and about in our land. Those aren't conspiracy theories per se, are not unheard of by any means in our country, or in a lot of countries. I think what's different about this time, and here I would defer to Ron as the historian, but I think what's different this time is that more than usual, not unprecedented in American history, but more than usual, these conspiracy theories have been mainstreamed. They're now part of our national bloodstream. I think part of that has to do with the advent of social media, but there are a lot of other reasons as well. But I think what happened a year ago symbolized the state of the country, and it's a divided country. This didn't happen, ex nihilo. This didn't come out of nowhere. We're a country that's been struggling. In 2020, we faced a once in a century pandemic. We saw racial unrest, protests in the streets, this deeply contentious election, obviously, as well as this unprecedented act of political violence at the citadel of democracy. Even the pandemic is taking place in a kind of culture war context, which is an astonishing thing to happen, and it's at a human cost. I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of people who are dead today because we didn't take the steps that were, in my estimation, eminently reasonable to have taken. But somehow, even this pandemic, measures like wearing masks, social distancing, and vaccines has gotten entwined into partisan politics and the larger culture wars. And then, if you survey the data, the partisan views of opposing parties are more negative than they've been at any point in memory. that there are knowledgeable observers saying the nation's confronting the greatest strains of fundamental cohesion since the Civil War. Majorities in both parties expressed not just unfavorable views toward the other party, but very unfavorable views, fear, anger, hatred. Studies tell us that Democrats and Republicans consider the other side, members of the other side, to be hypocritical, selfish, closed-minded, to the point that they're not even willing to socialize with others. So that is the context in which this is taking place. It's negative. I don't mean to be a downer, but on the other hand, we shouldn't be Pollyannas about this. We can't avert our gaze from the realities of the situation we face. Otherwise, we're not going to be in a position to deal with them and address them. The other thing I would say is I am concerned if I took a step back of maybe a 15,000-foot view of where things are, that there are both authoritarian movements in this country and sort of anti-democratic impulses in the country, a kind of pincer movement against liberal democracy. I actually think that, as the name implies, or as the term implies, pincer movement, it's coming from two directions. I think the radical left has some deeply illiberal tendencies that we see manifesting itself. Most of those have been confined in the last 25, 30 years to the academy, but we've seen it spread into other places. Certainly in the world of journalism, I have many friends who are journalists, many of whom are people of the center left or liberals. And there are really horror stories about what they feel like in terms of the effort to try and shut down speech, public discourse, public discussion, public debate. There's a lot of fear, including by prominent journalists, because of a younger generation that seems to want to shut down debate. That's coming from the left. We see it with publishing houses, cancel culture, and so forth. But I do, for part of the reasons that I articulated, I think that the graver threat to liberal democracy is coming from the right. And so this pincer movement, I think, is happening, and it's a source of deep concern. And I think we're reminded, and again, Ron, as the historian, would be able to tell us best about this, and his area of specialty, not his only area of knowledge, but his area of specialty, which was the Civil War. I think has a lot to teach us. Every historical situation is sui generis. None is an exact replica of the other, but sometimes there are echoes of the past. And I think what I've been struck by is that these divisions in our country are just deeper than certainly deeper than they've been in my lifetime. I do think that if you went to the late 60s, early 70s, it was a deeply contentious time. We can go into this during Q&A, but I think that this time is more perilous even than that. And that the membrane between civilization, barbarism, between democracy and authoritarianism is probably thinner than many of us in this country thought. It could be that over time, I think this is certainly true in my case. I didn't think that some of the things that are unfolding in America were gonna happen, but we're not immune to it. I should say something else as a person of the Christian faith. I've been a follower of Jesus really since the end of high school and college. That's when my pilgrimage and journey began. And I would say I hope it's true that it's the most central thing to my life. I would at least say that that the Christian faith has touched most areas in my life in terms of how I view things. Maybe the way to think about it is like food coloring. If you drop it into water, it sort of touches everything in there. And so for me, I think it's difficult to think about how I would view life exactly if I weren't a person of the Christian faith. That doesn't mean by any means my life has been transformed or regenerated in every area. It just means that it's influenced it, and it is important to me. And I think the white evangelical movement today in America is net a negative in terms of our political culture. Now that requires an important caveat. the evangelical movement in America is huge. Depending on which survey you follow, we're talking about 80 or 100 million people. And tremendous good is happening in individual lives and the lives of communities and the churches many of you have served in, and their acts of tenderness and mercy and care for the dispossessed and the lost and the poor and the hurt in life, and that shouldn't be overlooked. And my own life has been immeasurably helped and touched by people who walked the journey with me, who are people of the Christian faith. And I don't want to diminish that at all. I would say that the most prominent examples in the white evangelical world in terms of their engagement in politics, it's been harmful. And I think it's hurt politics, and I think it's hurt the Christian witness a great deal. And I think you see that in particular with the younger generation, who have not necessarily turned away from faith, but have turned away from institutional Christianity. But in some cases, they've turned away from faith. I was talking to a close friend of mine, actually was a person who's pretty instrumental in my own journey in faith. He is a pastor in the Pacific Northwest. And when we had lunch, when I was visiting there, it was breakfast, we were when I was visiting there, he used the phrase generational catastrophe of what was happening. And the short version, we can go into this during the Q&A, but I think the short version of what has happened is that for a lot of people of the Christian faith, their core identity is cultural, sociological, political, and partisan. And I think faith has got subordinated to partisan politics. I think in a lot of cases that's unwitting. I don't think that people are aware of it. It's often easy to see the confirmation bias and the chinks in the armor of other people, but not ourselves. We all struggle with these things. But I think that in far too many cases, faith has been subordinated to partisan politics, cultural identification, and then people go out and proof text scripture to support what are essentially ideological or cultural identities. So I think that there's a lot of challenges that we face, but I don't think that we're hopeless in terms of what we can do, or that we don't have weapons at our disposal. I think that there's a lot that can be done in terms of how we engage in politics, generally speaking, in terms of how to heal the breach in our politics. And that's, if I were to quickly go over the list, I'd say one is simply to vote for people who embody integrity and democratic virtues and honor. I think if government shows itself to be competent and begins to solve some public problems, and that we find a kind of inclusive prosperity, I think that would help, because I think when government is seen to fail, that hardens the soil so that conspiracy theories, when government succeeds, it'll harden the soil so that conspiracy theories don't take root. And the flip side of that is when government fails, then the soil becomes more amenable to conspiracy theories. I think there are changes that can be made in politics in terms of how states run their primaries, open primaries, and their elections. And I think that a lot more can be done, and in fact is being done, to help police social media platforms. I have a friend, John Roush, who wrote a really good book called Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth, and which I highly recommend to people. And he articulates some of the things that can be done. Stopping the disinformation campaign of hostile foreign powers is very important. Improving civic literacy, what I think can be a positive overarching American identity, not one that looks the other way in terms of the sins of America, which are real and considerable. But I do think that the American story has some wonderful and lovely moments, and those stories need to be told. I'm a fan of voluntary national service. And then there are civility programs, things like Braver Angels. I don't know if some of you are familiar with that, though, that offer models of how to engage in public discourse with people who disagree with you. And what the Braver Angels organization is interested in is not finding actually common ground. It's trying to model how to have civil disagreements. And then there's the strengthening of non-political institutions like churches and civic associations. So I think that there's a lot that can be done. And I think there are a lot of things that the church can do too. And I'm happy to discuss that more in terms of what Christians can do to I think, model a way of engagement in politics and in our lives that I think can really offer a way forward for Christians and for non-Christians, and really for the healing of our country. But let me just conclude with a couple of other thoughts, and then we'll go to the Q&A. The first thing I would say is extremely important, both, as I said, to acknowledge the nature of the threats that we face, that this is a perilous moment, but we have to reject cynicism and despair, and to remember that we're not passive actors in this drama. Sometimes when I have conversations with people, it strikes me that they talk about themselves almost as if we are corks caught in a river current, and that we have no capacity to control events or control the where we go or those currents. And in fact, we do. And the problems that we face have largely been created by us, and they can be solved by us as well. We're a self-governing country. And in the end, we get the government that we want, we get the country that we want and what we deserve. But we're not powerless to shape that future. The question, of course, is one of will and of wisdom, of whether we can summon the things that have to be summoned in order to heal our country and to learn to love the good and the true and the just. Politics isn't perfect. Countries aren't perfect, and we can't make perfection the price of confidence in our country. But those are certainly things we should aspire to. The second thing is not to lose perspective, and obviously I've alluded a couple of times to Ron here, but this is not the worst period that America has faced. You go back to the election of 1800, Jefferson and Adams. It was a vicious election. Historians say it almost tore the young republic apart. Obviously, we had the Civil War, where you had more than 700 million people killed in a country of 29 million. So that would be the equivalent of roughly 7 to 8 million people today. And the awful ugliness of Reconstruction. I mentioned the late 60s and early 70s, which was a very contentious time. You had the Vietnam War, you had the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy. You had the riots in the streets that began with Watts, but spread throughout many cities. You had the March on the Pentagon, students taking over universities. You had the sexual revolution, the Stonewall riots, the shooting at Kent State in the early 70s. 5 domestic bombings a day was the average, actually, in the early 70s. So all these things are important to keep in mind, that America has faced challenges before, and the American capacity for self-renewal is considerable, and it's been part of the American story. One of my favorite lines is from Wordsworth in the poem the Prelude, which is a very long poem, but in it he says, "What we have loved, others will love, and we will teach them how." And it strikes me that there's a tremendous amount of wisdom in that, which is, if we love the right things, if our hearts are taken up and captured by the right things, the good things, the noble things in life, that will change us, and we will change others. And I do think that as individuals and in people of the Christian faith, if we embody communities and individual lives that are marked by human flourishing, by joy and delight, even in the midst of struggles and pain, that's a hugely inviting thing to people. And my sense is that there's a lot of loneliness, a lot of alienation that people are facing now. And if we can show them a better and different way, if we can offer safe harbor, that people will come. So it's a tough anniversary. It was an ugly day, but it's not the end of the story. And I think we have the capacity to write some wonderful chapters in the history of the country and really in the history of the Christian witness. And I hope we do. So it's been great to be with you, and I'll turn it over to you, Jim, if or others, if you want to field questions. I'll be happy to take them.
If I might intervene, thank you so much, Pete. I forgot to read the scripture or have us read the scriptures together. So as you're thinking about your questions, Jonas, if you can put up the scripture that Pete suggested for us, that might be a good transition. And we'll read this together, and then we may ask our questions, and Jonas will lead us in that in terms of how the questions will be then put to Pete. Let's say Jeremiah 29:7 together. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in its welfare, you will find your welfare. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Thank you. Let's open up now for comments and questions. Jonas, we'll let you be the orchestrator here.
Yes, I'd like to ask Peter if you can point to the Christian leaders who mean the most to you currently, and also to the political leaders who influence you the most.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I'd be happy to do it. In terms of Christian leaders, contemporary Christian leaders, I would say Philip Yancey has been an influential writer. He's become a friend. His book, The Jesus I Never Knew, What's So Amazing About Grace, really had a big impact on me. Also my daughter. It was interesting when I was talking to my daughter about, this is now a couple of months ago, people that we thought whose lives had generally been transformed as people of Christians. She mentioned Philip, whom she's gotten to know through me. Philip's life was a very difficult life. He just had a new memoir come out called Where the Light Fell. He grew up in a racist church, a very, very difficult, almost brutal, in some respects, emotionally brutal household. His father died before he was a year old, and his mother was clearly psychologically damaged. And his journey from that life to what he had become, which is, I think, an avatar of grace, has been to me a real model. And he's been a personal friend to me. Mark Laberton is someone I have enormous admiration and affection for, president of Fuller Seminary. I met Mark through a mutual friend years ago, but I've gotten to know him more lately. And I find Mark to be just a beautiful witness, a person of tremendous wisdom and tenderness. So he's very important to me. Tim Keller is somebody that I've known for many years now, formerly pastor at Redeemer Presbyterian, is now retired, involved with City to City. Tim is another close friend, source of wisdom to me. I think he has a very balanced view of Scripture. And I'd say Gary Haugen, who runs the International Justice Mission, which is one of the really wonderful charitable organizations, which is making a huge difference in the world, fighting sexual trafficking and helping really the dispossessed in life. So those are a few. Russell Moore. I mean, I could go on. Political leaders, historically, my favorite is Lincoln. Ron can tell you more about him than I can, but to me, he was just an extraordinary quality and almost a divine intervention to have had that figure at that time with those qualities, both the tenderness and the strength of purpose and will, and almost superhuman ability to absorb the pain of the country and not let that pain overwhelm him, and his sense of the beauty of his language was just extraordinary. There's just no figure in American history that I think is even comparable to him. I'd say Jefferson is high up, but I think Lincoln is in a category all of his own. And his mind, his ability to really link our struggle to the Declaration. And there's an argument about whether he correctly interpreted or reinterpreted the founders, but whether it was a correct interpretation or a reinterpretation, I think where he ended up was wonderful. Contemporary leaders, I'd say right now at this moment, Liz Cheney, because I think she's been an almost Thatcher-like figure for the Republican Party and for the country in the midst of all of that's unfolding. So I think right at this moment, I admire Liz a lot. I wish she had spoken out, more during the Trump presidency than she did, but I think that she understood what happened on November 3rd and January 6th as being a bright, bold line that was crossed. That was something that she just couldn't countenance, and she's paid a real price for it. And to me, one of the definitions of courage are people who do the right thing when they know there's a cost, and they do the right thing in any event.
Okay, next up, we have a question from Nancy Mackey.
Nancy, unmute yourself.
I tried. It said that I was muted by the center. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. Peter, thank you so much for your encouraging talk. I really need that. There's a phrase you use. I wonder if you could go into a little bit more. You said to reject cynicism and despair. Well, that's where I live. And I wonder, despair over what's happening to our country, how people define what America is. And I wonder if you could give suggestions about what concrete actions can Christians take toward those who seem to be living in the politics of resentment, people who feel that they have been left out and not recognized in the past. What can Christians do practically about that? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. It's a great question. Yeah, a friend of mine said something to me years ago, which I think is opposite to this moment and really to your question. And he said, you can be a theoretical pessimist, but you ought to be an operational optimist. And I think that's not a bad way to approach things. And I'll tell you one of the reasons why I think that cynicism and despair and are things that we need to reject. First is that I think if the people who are trying to achieve what is good and right in society, a just society, the moral good, if they throw up their hands and pull back and say, screw it, this is lost, it's not worth it, that seeds the ground to the pernicious and malicious forces in American politics, and that just shouldn't be done. The second thing I'd say is that life in politics, like life in general, is it never runs on a straight line trajectory. And there are often inflection points in the life of an individual or a life of a nation, which you don't know at the time, you don't know in advance. You only know them in retrospect. But all we can do is to be faithful to what we know to be right and true. we're not called as Christians to be successful. We're only called to be faithful. All of us would rather be successful and faithful, but that's not for us to decide. But I do think that when people are faithful, that things can change often faster than we think. And there are movements that can be catalyzed, or there can be deep currents that are happening that people really don't realize. But then the right person comes along, or the right group of people come along, or the right movement comes along, and things change. And again, we don't know. And then I would just say, as a person of the Christian faith, this is the way I guess that I've viewed it. I think this is theologically correct, but I may be wrong. But in any event, it is how I've seen my own journey of faith, and that is that we are actors in a drama, and we didn't write the drama, we didn't write the story. It's been written by God, and there's a beginning and a middle and an end, and there's a purpose. And at any given moment in time, we don't know exactly where we fit in that drama. And you may be in a particular act in the drama, or a chapter in the story, which is a very difficult one. And it's real. It doesn't mean that that pain, that sorrow, that grief that we go through often in an individual life, or in the life of a nation, isn't real. But it's not the full story. It's an unfolding story. And I think we just have to act in the confidence of that faithfulness, that God is the author of the story, and that we act faithfully within it. Just to be very more concrete, that's slightly abstract, I know, but to be more concrete, I think there are a number of things that Christians can do. I would say, just in an individual life, what I have found is the best way to try and reach people who have very different views than I do, views on politics, views just on the nature of reality, is to establish a human relationship. We know enough of human psychology to know that it's extremely rare that you're going to be able to overwhelm someone with arguments and get them to change your mind. In fact, the odds are that if you try and do that, the other person's going to dig in their heels. To the extent that I've had what I would consider to be healthy and fruitful exchanges with people, it's been when I've met with them, when I've tried to listen to their story, to listen to their perspective, to be understanding about where they are and why they are where they are, to have some degree of modesty about my own rightness, my own command of what's true and real, and to try and learn from others, as well as have them learn from me. But I do think that it's important to try and establish real human relationships before you can hope to reach them in any other realm. Just to give you some anecdotes that bear on this. There's a friend of mine who's a radio talk show host, who is a Trump supporter, and he and I obviously had differences. And I had written a piece in the New York Times. This must have been 2017, I think. It was a piece in the New York Times, if my memory is right, where I was critical of Trump for having fired James Comey. And he was very upset at my piece, wrote me an email. We were going back and forth. And about the second or third iteration, I could tell that the temperature was rising, particularly on his end. And he was starting to make kind of personal accusations against me. I think probably 10 or 15 years ago, I would have written a 10-page point-by-point rebuttal and would have tried to have left him in a smoldering ruin. I didn't do it in this case. What I did instead is I wrote him and I said, so-and-so, I'm not going to answer the charges that you made unless you really want me to. Let me tell you what I think is happening. And I went on to give the best good faith argument for how I think he saw his role in politics and how he viewed me. And I said, you know, for you, you're trying to put a premium on loyalty, and you think I'm being disloyal to your team, that I should know better, that I'm giving aid and comfort to an enemy that wants to destroy the country. You view yourself as sort of a lineman protecting the quarterback. And you don't need to be critical of Trump, because I was saying that I felt like intellectual honesty would require him to call out Trump in the same way that he would call out liberal Democrats. But I went through and I said, I think this is how you are viewing me and how you're viewing this moment in your own role in this. And I said, let me now explain how I view my role and how I'm seeing this. And I said, for me, it's how I would understand intellectual integrity, which is if Donald Trump did something that if Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton or Bill Clinton had done, if I'd have been critical of them, I have an obligation to be critical of him. I can't use double standards to say, well, if my team does it, it's okay, and if your team does it, it's a mortal sin. But I tried to be equally fair-minded in my articulation of both views, and I didn't try and persuade him. I just said, I think that's why we're talking past each other. And he wrote me back and he said, you know, I've read your note 2 or 3 times. And he said, it was like a light bulb going on. He said, I remember this line. He said, I'm not interested in being a independent voice. I'm an advocate. That's what I do. To make a long story shorter, we developed a friendship, and I took an interest in his life. In some of the grief that he suffered, some of the loss that he suffered in his life, and we have a very good friendship, and that friendship allows us to be able to communicate with each other, and for me to hear his perspective and learn from it, and I think for him to hear mine. There are a lot of other things I think that Christians can do. I think we can model listening well better. I think we can model what it means to debate and disagree well. I think we can model a kind of epistemic modesty and humility, where we don't sound like we have all the answers. I think we can model grace. Just one other story, which didn't have to do with me, but it's one that had a powerful influence on me on this point about modeling what it means to debate and disagree well. C.S. Lewis, all of you are probably familiar with Lewis and probably read him, maybe read him more than I have, though I've read him quite a lot. But in Surprised by Joy, it's about halfway through his book about his autobiography of faith. He talks about first friends and second friends, and Arthur Greaves was his first friend. He knew Arthur Greaves from childhood. And he said the first friend is the person where you start the sentence, the other person completes it. That person is your alter ego. It's like 2 raindrops on a windowsill joining together. And we all need that. We all need people, as Lewis said, it's sort of, you know, when he was talking about lovers looking face to face and friends looking shoulder to shoulder at the world together. The second friend is the person who's not your alter ego, but it's your anti-self. That's the person, Lewis said, where you both read the same books and the other person draws all the wrong conclusions from the book. And for him, that was Owen Barfield. And he and Barfield had some pretty intense debates, esoteric debates at the time. But they had a lovely friendship. I think the first book that Lewis ever dedicated was to Owen Barfield, whom I believe he referred to Barfield as his first and greatest teacher. But the interesting thing is that Lewis and Barfield treasured their relationship precisely because they didn't see things the same way, but because they felt like that their relationship together helped widen the aperture of their understanding. And Barfield said later that when he and Lewis would debate, they never debated for victory, they debated for truth. And that's an entirely different disposition when it comes to what the purpose of dialogue is. And I think if we as Christians were to debate more for truth rather than victory, and modeled that, I think it would be a wonderful and inviting thing.
Okay, we have another question from the chat from Betty. She says, Sarah Posner's book, Unholy, Why White Evangelicals Worship at the Altar of Donald Trump, lays out how the far right has worked for years to replace someone in the White House to do their bidding politically. I struggle with how to talk to people, some in my family, who believe that the beliefs of the religious right should take precedence on issues like abortion and immigration. How do we talk to each other?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, and it dovetails nicely with what we've been talking about before. Some of it, I would say, just depends on who the other people are, and what the context is. I told some stories of people that I've connected with, even though I've had deep political differences with them. Some people I have basically bracketed the conversation, certainly the political conversations, until we get to a different moment. Honestly, I don't think that's because of me. I think most people who would know me over the course of my life would say temperamentally, I'm not particularly volatile. But politics is a lot of passion, and if you're dealing with people who are inflamed by politics, who are angered by it, you can almost see the amygdala region of their mind lighten up when certain issues come up. It just may not be constructive to talk about politics. You just may have to bracket it and say, look, we're just going to have disagreements, and there's a lot of life. There should be a lot in life that we talk about. One of the things that concerns me is that politics has pervaded almost every nook and cranny of our lives, in a way that's not healthy. And I don't think that politics has ever been equipped to try and carry that kind of freight. So some of it, I think, is just discernment and wisdom. And if you're talking about immigration and abortion, you're dealing with some pretty hot issues right there. I guess just to echo what I said before, if I were to have those conversations, I think the most constructive way to do it, and maybe the way that models most for how Jesus would do it, would be to ask a lot of questions, and make them genuine questions. I just did a piece in the New York Times in this last December for Christmas, where the Times has been great. I've written about 15 meditations on Christianity, Christ, the resurrection, the crucifixion, the incarnation, grace, humility. So even though I know that the Times is not liked by a lot of conservatives and they think it's a secular newspaper that has no place for Christians, it certainly hasn't been in my experience. But in any event, I did my most recent piece on Jesus using his method of discourse, and it focused in particular on the parables and on his use of questions. And I was quite struck. I mean, I knew about it going in. It was the thesis of my piece, but I was really quite struck in how often Jesus used questions and how skillfully he used them. And I think that that's a great way to try and hear where people are coming from. So you don't go immediately to, look, your view on abortion, pro-life, pro-choice, or whatever it may be, or immigration restriction versus bringing people in. But it's more a sense of, tell me how you came to the position you hold. Tell me more about your life experience. Do you have any struggles with the views that you hold? What do you think is the strongest argument against the position you hold? What would you say to somebody else, who holds a view different than yours? What do you wish that they understood about you? I think those kind of questions opens the way to communications. Think about it, I suppose, in a way, just in a human relationship with a spouse or a friend. If you're having an argument with somebody, and the other person doesn't feel heard, or they feel like what they've said has not been validated, they've just been dismissed. And if my wife comes to me with something that she's been hurt by or struggling with, and my response is, well, here's what ticks me off about you, or here's the things that's bothering me. I mean, that's just not going to be a constructive outcome. So I think part of it is just kind of human relationships 101 brought into politics. You're not likely in most cases, honestly, to change the view of the other person, but it may open up the conversations. It may open up different avenues that are not political, but are actually more important than politics.
Thank you, Peter. Bruce is asking, in the list of solutions to today's conflict, you mentioned stopping the disinformation campaign. How can we do this?
Well, it's actually been done pretty well in other countries. There are other countries that have dealt with this, particularly ones that, like Ukraine, that have dealt with Russia, and there is a kind of information warfare that we're familiar with, and so there are countermeasures and adaptations that the mainstream media is taking into account: election security, scholarly understanding. I mean, there's increasing scholarship on what to do. We do see social media changes that are different now than 2016. I mentioned the John Rausch book that documents some of the things that can be done. So it's not as if there aren't other countries that haven't faced this situation or faced the situation worse than we have. Some of it has to do with the identification. Some of it just has to do with saying to other countries, we know what you're doing, and making it a price or having it a cost if they cross certain lines related to American elections. So that's the most obvious thing of all. Then we're learning more and more about how do you counteract the misinformation and disinformation. Fact checking doesn't always work, but there are different kinds of fact checking. Some of it has to do with getting people who are within a movement who have broken away from the movement. So, for example, if you're, this is not foreign misinformation, disinformation, but it is a misinformation of a kind. So if you are trying to reach people who are supporters or sympathetic to QAnon, it sometimes helps to have people who are part of the QAnon movement who have broken away to talk about what they had experienced, because there's a kind of kinship in a way, or at least people on the same frequency. But you can prove the possible by the actual, as they say in philosophy. And there are countries that I think have a lot to teach us. I think Madeleine Albright has headed up some commissions on this, and there are others. I think what happened in 2016 is that the particular misinformation, disinformation, foreign disinformation campaign was so new to us. It had entered a different realm. It wasn't as if other countries, particularly the Soviet Union during the Cold War, hadn't tried to pull some of these shenanigans, but they tried it in a new and different, I think, more effective way in 2016. And there's a lag time when you're hit by something you've not dealt with before. It takes time to generate a response, and I do think that we're doing that. But we have a long way to go, and this is a big part of the puzzle, big piece of the puzzle.
Thanks, Peter. We have two more questions. Barbara says, "Splendid and hopeful message on this day of reflection. Many thanks. I heard someone this morning comment on the shift in public education to achievement testing has pushed aside the arts, but also civics lessons. You mentioned the importance of civic literacy. Do you think the decline of civic literacy and public education has contributed to our current national incivility?"
I do. It's a good question, and I do, because I think that we've lost a sense of a national story and a national purpose. And that's a kind of amorphous concept, but it's real nonetheless, and it's important. And if you don't have ties that bind you to a nation, you lose national cohesion and national purpose. And eventually you break into tribes, warring tribes. And I think that's increasingly what we're doing. And Jonathan Haidt, who's a wonderful moral psychologist at NYU, used to be at University of Virginia, wrote a great book called The Righteous Mind. Why good people, I'm going to mess up the subtitle, but why good people disagree on politics and religion. And it's Haidt is John's last name. He's written about confirmation bias, and that's a huge part of the story, but also about the importance of civic literacy. And so I do think that trying to reclaim a serious civic literacy would be really helpful to our country. It would place our story in a larger story. It would help us to learn from good examples and learn from bad examples. And it would create a sense of connection. Now, having said that, trying to pull off civic literacy in the current political climate is really, really tough. And we're seeing that in the state I live in, Virginia, where there are tremendous battles over school curriculum. And we may be at a point right now where the animosity and antipathy is so great that trying to settle on what is a serious civic literacy program and what should be taught in the schools may not be particularly possible now. I hope that's not the case. And I know from my own work in education, I used to work at the Department of Education when Bill Bennett was Secretary of Education in the Reagan years, and I was just a young pup, that civic education, when it's done right, can be a good thing.
Thanks, Peter. Terry McGonigal has a question about the church and violence, and I think he would like to elaborate.
Yeah, Peter, I know we're almost out of time, and I hesitate to even ask this with just a few minutes left, but this morning, several of us up and down the West Coast, from California to Oregon to Washington, have been working on this project of how to support pastors, particularly in the midst of all the incredible pressures that they have felt over the last few years, politics, COVID, et cetera, and one of the people from Central Oregon made the comment that there's this mass exodus of pastors in Central Oregon because the most armed, and by armed I mean literally owning guns, getting ready for violence, is emerging out of evangelical churches, and they want nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
Earlier, you had mentioned the cultural and demographic and political ideologies that sort of permeate the church and create pressures. And that's just an illustration I ran into, ironically, this morning on the first anniversary of January 6th. So now pastors are saying, I'm out of here. I can't carry this anymore. Yeah. Just any comments?
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing those. It's a painful turn of events. It's not surprising to me. I did a piece for the Atlantic called the Evangelical Church is Breaking Apart. It was in October, and I interviewed probably, I don't know, between 30 and 40, primarily pastors, but also theologians, academics, church historians. And my thesis was exactly what you're alluding to, which is the antipathy and the conflict that is finding its way into many evangelical churches today. I've heard from countless pastors, friends of mine, some of whom tears in their eyes at lunch, talking about what was unfolding in their churches and the divisions that were happening. I must say that I knew that this was happening, but I was taken somewhat aback by the responses I got. Not a single person challenged my thesis, and most of them just built on it and just told me stories within their own church. Not I didn't hear one quite like the one you heard of. It's happening in Central Oregon. It doesn't actually surprise me, given Oregon's a funny state, so it has very progressive elements in it, and then it has very right-wing elements in it, sort of like Washington State as well. So I really feel for a lot of pastors. They got into the ministry. Maybe you did. I think probably a lot of people on this call, because they're followers of Jesus. They love Christ, and they want to minister to people, and they want to preach, and they want to spread the good news. They're excited about that, and the idea that congregations would be divided by politics of all things is just very, very difficult. And a lot of these pastors just don't have any interest. They're not particularly political themselves, or if they're political, they keep their views to themselves, I think rightly so. I don't know what the short-term answer is. I mean, if you've got people in your congregation that are arming up, and you feel like a congregation has jumped the rails, or that they're out. I should say, by the way, that from a lot of pastors that I've heard, it's nothing like a majority of the people in the congregation. But the thing I've heard again and again and again is it only takes a small group of difficult people who are committed to make life miserable for pastors. Sometimes it involves, elders or whatever the version of the oversight committee within an individual church is, that can create a lot of difficulty. And it's true in a family too. You can have a lot of kids. If you have one really difficult child, it can break apart the entire family system. But in the end, I mean, there are a lot of, I think, individual things that pastors would know, different programs that work, models to go to, talking to people like Tim Keller, who I know is working on sort of models of how to heal and how the church can be a healing force. I do think that in the end, it's a somewhat simple answer, but I think there's some truth, a lot of truth to it, which is that those of us who are followers of Christ just have to have our lives transformed in ways that is not happening in sufficient numbers right now. And I don't know that there are a lot of shortcuts to faith being a powerful influence on people's lives, other than faith being a powerful influence on our own lives and in our own hearts. And that we become, ambassadors to Christ in the best way possible. I think about it a little bit like, when I'm asked how do churches, recover from the current brokenness and divisions, and I think about it a little bit like a person who's overweight and wants to lose weight, and you say, come to you, and they say, look, how do I lose weight? And you say, well, I have a couple of ideas, and they say, but let me say two things. The first thing is I don't want to change my diet, and I don't want to exercise more. Now tell me how to lose weight. It's like, I want the church to model Christ and the Spirit of Christ and the fruits of the Spirit. But I want to do it without having, my own intimacy with Christ increased. I don't know quite how you get there. And I have come to believe that the church is an institution, absent intimacy with Christ in people's hearts, doesn't have a lot to offer the world. It certainly doesn't have anything unique to offer the world. Yancey Philip has written about this, where, I think he quotes Gordon MacDonald, who says that the world can offer everything the church can offer except grace. And in my experience, when the world, the non-Christian world, has seen grace embodied in Christians, that's the one thing that cuts through in a way that nothing else does. Because I'm not sure that the world has the understanding or the instruments of grace that Christians do when it's exercised properly. And I think about what happened in Charleston, South Carolina, when Dylan Roof massacred those African Americans at the AME church. And they had the arraignment of Dylan Roof. And they had these people of the Christian faith face him and say through tears of grief that they forgave him because they were Christians. And I was so moved by that. And I sent a link of that moment to a friend of mine who's an atheist. And he told me how powerfully that affected him. And another time, when a very dear friend of mine, Steve Hayner, was dying of pancreatic cancer, and Steve was a real mentor of mine, a person I love deeply. And he was on the Caring Bridge. He did this chronicled journey toward death, he and his wife Cheryl. And there was one very honest and deeply moving post that Steve had put up. And I copied and sent it to an atheist friend of mine. He's actually Jewish, gay, and atheist. And but he's a close friend of mine, and he's a close friend of mine. And I said, I thought you'd want to see this. And he wrote me back and he said, Pete, I've never understood the concept of grace before, but having seen how Steve is leading his life as he's moving toward death, has helped me understand it better. And he said, it's at times like those that I wish I could believe. And I thought, well, there you go. If that's what we want, that's the way to do it. To live your life in a way that's different than it would be lived if you weren't a follower of Jesus, and to live it in a way that a watching world can look. And even if they don't quite get it, they can say there's something to it that I wish I had, that I wish could be imparted to me, because if it did, it would change my life and change my heart and change my hope. And so I think that's probably been the history of the church at its best over the last 2,000 years. And I suspect it'll be the history of the church until Christ returns.
Well, I think we don't want to end. I think we're so appreciative, Pete, of your thoughtfulness, your faith, your wisdom and experience, and all of those who've asked comments or asked questions. Been a marvelous afternoon. We're grateful. Jim, we'll let you tell us now what we're going to do next Thursday.
There we are. I had it muted because my dog was barking. So Peter has ended with some comments on grace. It seems to me that perhaps the best example of grace in American history, I would say, maybe next to Lincoln, would be Dr. Martin Luther King. And our speaker next Thursday, it will be Gerald Rivers. He is one of the preeminent interpreters of Dr. King in America. I heard him at All Saints Episcopal Church a year ago and was deeply moved, not only because he was able to express what King says in a powerful way, but he interpreted it so it responded to the needs of the kind of questions that Peter has been answering for us today. So please join us next week at 4 p.m. Gerald Rivers is our speaker, and I know he will be an inspiration and a guide for us. Thank you for watching us today on our first convocation. And again, thank you, Peter Wehner, for a very powerful, moving talk. Thank you.